Tonight, let me just say, City Lights is so excited to be featuring Cynthia Haven in conversation with James Marcus, discussing Cynthia's new book, Czesław Miłosz, A California Life. Let's give it up. Let's give it up, y'all. This is publication date. You got to work for this, people. Give me some Zoom claps. Come on, come on. I'm shameless with the book Zoom clap. So there it is. Yes. This is a beautiful book, and it's the first book to look at the life of this amazing poet through a California lens. Cynthia is a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar and the author of 2018's Evolution of Desire, Life of René Girard, the first ever biography of the French theorist. Cynthia has published 2 previous books on Czesław Miłosz, An Invisible Rope, Portraits of Czesław Miłosz, and Czesław Miłosz, Conversations. She has been a Milena Jesenská Journalism Fellow with the Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen in Vienna, as well as a visiting writer and scholar at Stanford's Division of Literature, Cultures, and Languages, and a Voegelin Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute. Cynthia has written for the Times Literary Supplement and has also contributed to the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and other fine publications. And joining Cynthia tonight in conversation is James Marcus. James is the author of Amazonia, 5 years at the epicenter of the .com juggernaut, and 7 translations from the Italian, including Giacomo Casanova's The Duel. James is the former editor of Harper's Magazine, has contributed to the New York Times, The Atlantic, Harper's, The American Scholar, VQR, The Guardian, The Nation, and Best American Essays. James has also edited and introduced Second Read, Writers Look Back at Classic Works of Reportage, and he's currently at work on his next book, Glad to the Brink of Fear, a portrait of Emerson in 15 installments. All right, mi gente, this is going to be so good. And for those of you that haven't purchased his book yet, I mean, this is a book release, so this is your chance. There's going to be a link to purchase the book in the chat posted throughout the conversation. And one last friendly detail, we are going to be having a Q&A at the end with Cynthia and James. So if you have any questions for them, please post your question in the chat function and James will read them at the end of the reading. Okay, now please give it up, give a warm Zoom land welcome to Cynthia L. Haven, excuse my tongue tonight, and James Marcus. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, thank you everybody for turning out this evening. Of course, I want to thank City Lights, and I want to thank Cynthia for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I've loved Czesław Miłosz's poetry for many decades, and I've been a big fan of Cynthia's for not quite as long, but for quite a while. So this is a particular pleasure for me. I suppose the question I wanted to start with is that I feel that this marvelous book of Cynthia's poses 2 very big questions sort of at its core. One of them is, how did California change Czesław Miłosz? And the other one is, how did Czesław Miłosz change California? In the sense of our poetic or mythological sense of the place. Now that's an awful lot to bite off for one question. So maybe we can go to the first half of that. And I was hoping that Cynthia could say a few words really about what brought Miłosz to California in the first place, and maybe say a little bit about the conditions of his life there.
Well, as you know, my book begins with a chapter called The Burning City. That's after the introduction. I begin with the burning of Warsaw. But he'd already lost several worlds by then. He was born in Lithuania to the Polish-speaking gentry, so he was like Mickiewicz, a Polish speaker in a Lithuanian. He didn't learn Lithuanian until very late in his life. And people make much of his Lithuanian childhood. He made much of it in his poetry, but as Claire Cavanaugh points out, he actually didn't spend much time there. His father was a civil engineer because Lithuania was part of the Russian Empire, and he was traipsing around Russia with his family during the Russian Revolution. The loss of Lithuania, the loss of Warsaw, many of his friends died during the Warsaw Uprising. He had a very strong reaction to the idealism that led them to fight, holding out against the Nazis, and the perishing of a generation of Polish intellectuals, writers, and poets was very formative too. Then he worked for a time in Washington and New York City as a cultural attaché and was reposted back to Paris, where he defected shortly afterwards. So that was the loss of a whole other world.
Mhm.
By the time he got to California, he'd survived the perishing of several worlds, and that features in his poetry, the sense of perishability, the sense of the desperate attempt to try to save things from oblivion.
It's like a series of multiple conflagrations, just consuming everything behind him, really. Some literal conflagrations and some metaphorical ones instead.
So what did California give him? First of all, a tenured job at UC Berkeley, which in turn gave him a parking spot, not to be after he got the Nobel. The stability of California, the stability of a job. He had not been a teacher. Like Joseph Brodsky, he had not been a teacher when he got a permanent post in an American university. I talk about what he did during his years here, the miracle of Polish poetry in the 20th century, with 2 Nobels, well, 3 counting the very early one, was largely his doing.
You write quite a lot about his sense that he had to create a sense of Polish poetry, contemporary Polish poetry, and almost imagine the audience into existence between his work.
Yes.
As a teacher, but also as a historian of Polish poetry and as an anthologist of Polish poetry.
Well, there was nobody even here. He translated Herbert. He translated, he championed the work of other, but there wasn't anybody really here to translate him. So he trained a generation of translators. Mm-hmm. So they're the ones that have brought many of his students, Richard Laurie, Lillian Valley, many others are the people that actually were the ones that brought him into English.
And Robert Haas, of course.
Robert Haas wasn't a student, of course.
No, but I mean.
One of my favorite quotes from Robert Haas was, at an age when, I can't quote it exactly, at an age when most writers are kind of learning to live off their laurels, he had the chance to apprentice himself and put himself in a more humble position in relation to a world poet of enormous magnitude. That was a remarkable thing for Bob Haas to do. And as I comment in the book, you can't have a conversation with Bob Haas for half an hour without him bringing up Miłosz. It was utterly transformative for him as a poet and as an individual.
Yeah. Now, when exactly did Miłosz arrive in California?
1960.
Okay. And, you've already mentioned this, and perhaps we can double back for a moment. You do explain that his first landfall in the US was New York City in 1946. And so we had a sort of earlier encounter with America, which was in more generally on the East Coast, in New York City, but also on the East Coast. And he has that amazing line that you quote in the book where he says, "I plunged into books on American flora and fauna and made diplomatic contacts with porcupines and beaver in the forests of Pennsylvania." Can you talk a little bit about his time in New York and Washington? Because that's a very interesting prelude, I think, to the 4 decades he spent on the other coast.
It was. He considered his first calling as a naturalist. He was always very interested in the trees and the plants and the beavers and the raccoons. So a lot of his talk about that, but what's remarkable is how quickly he plunged himself into the world of American literature. He wrote columns for the Polish people on Robert Lowell, T.S. Eliot, E. Cummings, Carl Shapiro. He attended the 1947 Breadloaf Conference.
That's a strange idea, isn't it?
Yes, it is. He had a low-ranking position, cultural attaché. It was largely involved with cultural exchanges, which were not frequent during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. But he was very lucky to get out of Warsaw. I know people criticized him for serving the Stalinist government, even Anne Applebaum recently in a column for having a government, but it basically meant he had a job. There weren't many jobs in the ruins of Warsaw.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this was a chance for him to come to expand his wings. Zbigniew Herbert was desperate to get out of Poland and couldn't. He spent quite a bit of time here learning about us. What was reaction? He was kind of appalled, wasn't he?
Appalled by America.
Appalled by the wholeness and by being in a place that was completely unscathed at all that had happened.
Yeah, well, he has that line from his poem to Allen Ginsberg, where he says, "I lived in the America of Moloch, short-haired, clean-shaven, tying neckties and drinking bourbon before the TV set every evening," which
that's the Allen
Ginsberg he didn't write this at that time, but it is a lip-curling assessment of America's freedom from the kind of catastrophe he had seen, back in Poland.
And at the same time, he very quickly took in people like Peter Dale Scott, who was newly arrived from his own appointment as a Canadian diplomat. And he was already bringing people in to help translate. And the stability of America enabled his enormous productivity and enabled us to experience worlds we never would have without him. I mean, it's... They were all transformed by it, and they became seeds that went out and transformed others.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just roll back the tape just to dwell for another minute or two on his interval in New York, because it's in a way represents, or at least you speculate that the ways in which it represented some of his first personal contact with some of the great American or America-based poets of the day. And you speculate that you feel like he may have had some contact with Auden, who was living in New York City at the time.
Well, that was W.H. Auden, or that was Peter Dale Scott's supposition because of the translation of a poem by Mickiewicz. Because Auden was apparently very cautious about translating from languages he didn't know and didn't have, and that there was a connection over that poem. So he also it's the dog that didn't bark. Miłosz was going out of his way to meet all the important writers in New York City. Auden was the giant among them. He thinks it's almost impossible that they didn't meet, but it is speculative somewhat. Yeah. And that the evidence is this one poem, Auden translated by Mickiewicz.
Yeah. Well, let's, since we're rambling around the time and space here a little bit, and since we're on the topic of Milosz's productive collisions with important American poets, two in particular that you talk about in the book are his relationship with Robinson Jeffers, who was a very Californian poet, and his relationship with Allen Ginsberg, who is a Whitmanian, Pan-American, all-encompassing poet. But it seems like he took different things from these two people, and his fructifying relationship with the two of them was different. Could you address those two relationships just a little bit?
Well, of course, he never met Jeffers. His encounter was strictly poetic. But what daunted him about America was the enormous scale of everything. He thought there was, and of course, Jeffers' Inhumanism. I had a passage I just remembered. No, I can't find it. It was something from Jan Blonsky. The Inhumanism. Jeffers, for those who don't know him, was a poet who saw mankind as a blight on the landscape, and looked forward to a time when the rocks and the hawks would dominate again, and mankind would be washed into the sea. This was wholly antithetical. He was very much a precursor of the environmental movement that really didn't exist then. But the enormous humanism of Czesław Miłosz was totally antithetical to that. But he was daunted by the courageous stand that Jeffers took. And he was daunted by his embracing of nature, which also was a big thing for Miłosz, although Miłosz was more used to the small scale of a Polish landscape. I suppose Poles would take offense at that, but there's the scale of Yosemite and all of that. Ginsberg, he admired the daring of Ginsberg. He admired the daring of Howell. He admired the willingness, which in a sense is the same as the daring. It's a different flavor of the same daring that Jeffers undertook. But he thought it was indecent to expose, say, his mother died, as he did in the poem Kaddish. And yet he admired the nerve. He admired the willingness to go out to the limits, as Jeffers went out to the limits. And well, there's the incident that I recount where Ginsberg comes up to him when they finally meet and says, "You know, you're not as much of a square as you look."
Oh, he looked like more of a square than Ginsberg, but still.
And Miłosz was very proud of that and repeated it again and again.
Since we're heading in that direction, why don't we talk for just a minute also about the very complicated relationship Miłosz had to politics. I mean, to global politics, European politics, and American politics. As you note in your book, during the period Miłosz lived in Paris, he was suspected by some of being an agent of the precursor to the KGB. Once Miłosz came to America initially as a functionary of the Soviet Polish government, the FBI assumed that he must in fact be a Soviet spy. And there's some fascinating material in your book about the FBI tracking Miłosz and snooping on him, and its assumption that he had to be some kind of a security operative, right?
There was, I was able to get some Freedom of Information Act documents about Tracy. They even knew his seat on the trains that he was taking. They knew about his bank accounts.
That's detailed. That's very detailed. Yeah.
It was, but don't forget that he was also being spied on by the Polish security too.
Of course.
And there's much more material about that now in Poland. So he had no friends anywhere. He defected in Paris. When he was asked to describe his defection, of course, he wrote Captive Mind, a searing indictment of the effect of totalitarianism on the mind. He said you could train yourself to swallow frogs. You might be able to get one down or two down, but at some point the stomach revolts.
Mm-hmm.
That was his reaction to communism. It was a revolt of the stomach.
Yeah, yeah.
But he defected in one of the worst possible places to defect, and that was Paris, because the entire intelligentsia of Paris was pro-Stalin. So he immediately, Neruda famously wrote an essay called "The Man Who Ran Away," running away from the future. Pretty much everybody abandoned him in Paris, all his friends, except for Albert Camus, who befriended him during that time.
And they abandoned him for explicitly political reasons, you're saying?
He was not one of them anymore. But that's
right. Yeah.
That's kind of the experience of Miłosz's life at multiple points. He was not one of anyone. The Polish American community was up in arms against him because he was from the Stalinist government. They didn't trust him. They didn't think he was one of them. So he was taking water from all sides. Who were some of the other groups that the FBI reports? He was also, I described the Cold War era, and I think we blow it off too quickly and caricature it too easily. We have to remember that half of Europe had been swallowed by this. It was not a phony scare. We didn't understand until the 1980s, when things fell apart for Russia, how fragile it was, that it never had there was never the power that it was puffing itself up to be.
Mm-hmm.
But that back then we didn't know. Yalta had just happened. Suddenly all these people were, millions of people were now under this regime. So there was a real fear of that. But also the FBI dossiers recount the thing that he was a proven they say he was a proven homosexual.
Yes, there was that as well, right?
So he was caught by the lavender scare as well. So, more and more groups didn't like him.
Yeah, no, I mean, you give a very vivid sense of that in the book, that just Milos, I think a man of like enormously deep moral principle, but not necessarily an explicitly political animal, was just taking fire from all sides, as you say. And some of it is ridiculously misplaced. And some of it, even to take a great book like The Captive Mind, which is certainly an amazing body blow and argument against authoritarianism and against any sort of mind-forged manacles. But I mean, that was folded into sort of a neoconservative argument. People took whatever they wanted from him, at any given moment. And yet he sort of continued to elude any easy political classification himself.
It wasn't until I think the Nobel, just about the time of the Nobel, where he started developing a reputation as a poet that was bigger than his reputation as a political thinker. On that basis, I think it's still his best-selling book.
The Captive Mind is.
I think so. I believe it is.
Yeah. And then to try out this thread a little further, you have Milos. At a certain point, he's in Berkeley in the 60s and the 70s, and he's dealing with the political ferment on the Berkeley campus and throughout.
And they didn't like him either.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about his relationship to that ferment, that specific ferment?
Well, he was more sympathetic to the students. It was troubling for him to have been considered a liberal in Poland. He was, and then suddenly to come here and suddenly he's the derriere guard. He was sympathetic to the students, but he did say he thought they rage because they have too much. And he was reminding people that the Russian students had no rights at all. He thought, I think he saw it as self-indulgent. And there's that famous incident where he is surrounded by students who aren't letting him pass. And he, in his best Slav accent, he says, "Begone, spoiled children of the bourgeoisie."
Yes, that was an excellent moment. Yeah.
And that they parted and made way for him. I think he thought they were spoiled children of the bourgeoisie, and yet he was often sympathetic. He was against the Vietnam War, but he had seen so much at that point. He'd seen these, equally sympathetic students in Poland being mowed down with guns.
Right. Okay. Well, we can circle back to this and to some of these questions. I think this might be a good point actually for you to perhaps read a couple of passages from the book, just so the audience can get a sense of what it sounds like. And then we can continue our conversation. So why don't you read a couple of passages and we'll just listen.
Well, you suggested the solidarity section. So this is a story of him going back to Poland. And a number of people like this passage, so I'll read this one for you. One of the native trees that must have baffled Miłosz on his arrival to California is the Populus tremuloides, the quaking or golden aspen. Like, but not like, the Populus tremula of Northern Europe, the American aspen was another of nature's variations on a melody, the music that disconcerted the exiled Pole. They grow quickly, straight and tall to 80 feet, and while they are not as obviously dramatic as the coastal redwoods of California, they have some distinctions of their own. In autumn, the silvery trees bear golden leaves like something out of a fairy tale. Here is their secret. The coastal redwoods are not the oldest trees in America, nor are the bristlecone pines of California's Sierra Nevada, whose most ancient denizen is over 5,000 years old. That privilege goes instead to this less ground, less touted species, the quaking aspen of the American West. And an aspen forest may appear to have many trees, but they are in fact a single organism sharing one massive root system that supports hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of trees, all genetically identical. Some estimate that one of the oldest known aspen clonal colonies is 80,000 years old, which would make it the world's oldest organism. With more than 40,000 stems on a mammoth root system that weighs in at 13 million pounds, it is also one of the most massive. For this reason, it is hard to kill an aspen root system. Another reason is this: they propagate quickly. The seeds can germinate and grow in a single day. Cut down every single tree and the organism can still recover. The root system can lie dormant for many years, lurking in the dark earth, biding its time for its moment, its sunlight, before surfacing once again. It is indefatigable, quickly colonizing recently burned or bare areas to establish a new stand of young trees. Its power is underground. Let it be an analogy then for the people in a faraway country who had been waiting during the years of partition, the years of occupation, the years of repressive and murderous Soviet rule. They discovered power through peace, taken even to martyrdom. Like the aspen, this power proved difficult to annihilate and was coming to the surface after years of suffering and silence. The first trade union in the communist bloc was born in the Gdansk shipyards in 1980 under the leadership of Lech Walesa. Solidarity was poetry in motion, poetry in politics. And within the first year, over a quarter of Poland's population, about 10 million, had joined it. What started out as a trade union quickly became a nonviolent social movement, with private homes hosting history classes and book lovers discussing forbidden writers in church basements. The Polish people took heart that their exiled poet won the Nobel in that magic year, 1980, only 2 years after the popular Archbishop of Krakow had been elected to the papacy, the first non-Italian to be elected in 4 centuries. And he encouraged the people to be not afraid. The summer after he won the Nobel, Miłosz returned to Poland for the first time in 30 years, a short visit to see for himself. His words from the penultimate stanza of You Who Wronged, a poem written in bitterness in 1950, but which could be written because he was in Washington, D.C. and not Warsaw, were engraved at the base of the Gdansk monument, erected when Solidarity was founded in 1980 to commemorate the workers killed by police decades earlier. He had written, "Do not feel safe, the poet remembers. You can kill one, but another is born. The words are written down, the deed, the date." In Poland, he was mobbed on the streets like a rock star, his wife Carol told friends later. He hadn't known whether he still had any audience in his native land after the censorship, after the years in exile, and so the crowd stunned him. Within days of his visit, the first official Polish publication of his poetry sold 150,000 copies. A bilingual Polish-English edition of his Nobel lecture was published. He was overwhelmed. He had no idea. The American critic, Helen Wendler, said, "I had never seen him so happy. He knew, but he didn't know because he hadn't seen. I'd never seen his face so transformed." He returned to the United States and assumed the Charles Eliot Norton Chair at Harvard for the year. His 6 public lectures, each passionately, elegantly, and eloquently exploring the role of poetry in the 20th century and beyond, eventually became the book The Witness of Poetry, which has been called one of the greatest series of literary lectures ever published. In December of 1941, martial law was declared again in Poland, and Miłosz was again a banned poet, read only in samizdat. But solidarity bided its time and could not be destroyed. The candle dimmed but was not extinguished. Massive strikes were followed by a semi-free election in 1989, and solidarity won in a landslide. As it was with Miłosz himself, so it was with a free Poland, born of a patient people waiting, so long it had become a habit. 6,000 miles away, the canary yellow forests of ancient aspens, known for the rustling, whispering sound of their heart-shaped leaves when the winds make them shimmer, a sound like applause or rain, offered a long, late round of gentle acclamation from another dimension altogether.
Thank you. That's a beautiful, beautiful passage.
So someone wanted him in the end after all.
Yes, as it turned out, quite a lot of people did want him in the end. Let me ask you about this. You write about this quite a lot in the book, that there is a kind of persistent tug of war, or let's say Miłosz feels a tug of two very different conceptions of how to write poetry, what sort of poetry to write. One is a very bardic idea of the poet who is in touch, with eternal things all the time. And the other is a kind of poetry, or at least a kind of art that is plunged into history, into the annealing furnace of catastrophic events, and which dwells in the sort of everyday, and he wrote in both of those modes throughout his career. I wonder whether you feel like California nudged him more in one direction or the other, or did he straddle these two modes the whole time? Or how would you give a brief overview of his response to two different ways of writing and seeing the world?
He was a man who could become intoxicated by the smell of an orange.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you noted that, yeah.
He was a man that saw a transcendent in the everyday. He had a remarkable ability to foresee many of the things that we're foreseeing now. I talk about his presaging of the environmental crisis, his sense that the sense of the TV and the advertising consumerism taking over. He was very troubled by that when he first came to the United States. I think he began to see one through the other. I don't think he saw them in separate categories. Mm-hmm. His images are constantly juxtaposing. Those two sisters from Lithuania crossing the Sonoran Desert mm-hmm. in his imagination.
Yeah. I mean, there is that very beautiful line of his that you quote where he says, "I am no more than a secretary of the invisible thing." Now, that is an orientation towards transcendence and eternity. But of course, like it or not, and in some ways very much against his will, he was plunged into some of the very worst horrors of 20th century history. And he couldn't really turn his face away from any of that.
No, there was no way you could. I guess I kind of, the Charles Eliot Norton lectures, I think, coined the phrase poet of witness. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one reason we read him so little and don't understand him, is people drop to one knee. When you mention his name, people drop to one knee and their faces get solemn and they go, "Oh, poetry of witness."
Yeah. But
he was also a poet of wonder. Mm-hmm. He was so many. I think he was a poet of wonder more than, well, I mean, you can't really weigh them. I think the effect that all this loss had on him was this desperate attempt to rescue every memory from oblivion. Mm-hmm. And I relate to that. I think we all relate to that as we get older. He was a poet of the world. He was a poet of, and as he got older and older, he was writing even from his hospital bed in his last days. He was writing. Mm-hmm. He is perhaps the best poet we have of old age since Walt Whitman.
Mhm.
And my personal hope is that we take him in as one of us. He was one of us and not one of us. I think he should be taught in classes alongside American poet. We have Juan Felipe Herrera as a California poet laureate writing in 2 languages. I think we ought to be more welcoming of these in classrooms. I think he has so much to teach us.
I mean, is your impression that Milos is not taught as part of the canon of American poetry? Is he still viewed in the academy as a Polish poet?
I think so, don't you?
I'm not entirely sure, but I agree with you that, I mean, as you say in the book, he spent 4 decades in California. He lived there longer than he lived any other place.
Exactly.
And responded in all sorts of intimate and artistic ways to that landscape. And it was folded into or merged into the landscape he brought with him. And in a way, he's a great poet of home as a portable construct. I mean, there's a couple of lines that you quote in here where he says, "Distance incites me to construct in my imagination a home located in history. Wherever I move on earth, I carry it with me as a snail carries its shell."
Yeah.
And that seems like a beautiful description, not only of his odyssey from Lithuania to California, but of course, he went back to Poland at the end of his life. He reversed that progress. And I have to be convinced that he brought California back to Poland with him, just as he had done in the other direction.
Well, maybe just a quote that I don't want to lose, just to add to yours, because I love it. He wrote, "The majestic expanse of the Pacific seacoast has imperceptibly worked its way into my dreams, remaking me, stripping me down, and perhaps thereby liberating me."
Yep, absolutely true and absolutely.
Yes, I think I heard from someone I can't recall whom that he in Poland he's considered an American poet.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Now that, to me, that seems ridiculous, because I mean, you're not going to deny these Polish, but it's just, it's a thing with colors. It depends on what color you have behind it, whether it appears orange or red. But then nonetheless, he had been Americanized, and the Poles could see that right off. I think his entrepreneurial spirit, he started exchange groups with American students, with Adam Zagajewski, bringing students back and forth, teaching them. He had a spirit that had been informed and invigorated by living in an entrepreneurial society. Much as he criticized it, he adopted some of its ways. And I think that, yes, I think that he ought to be brought into the American canon. That's my little sales pitch.
Well, that's an excellent sales pitch. Let's to come back to Earth just for a little bit. How you talk about it in the book, but maybe you could discuss a little bit just simply how winning the Nobel Prize in 1980 changed the trajectory of his life in some ways.
Well, people began seeing he was a poet and not just a political writer who written Captive Mind. Yes, it was enormously important for the Poles, of course. I mean, this was still, the era that was just beginning their own liberation. He started getting 4 duffel bags of mail a day.
I noticed that. It was like Beatlemania.
It was like Beatlemania. It was very much a before Nobel and after Nobel kind of world for him, and he did get an amazing amount of recognition. Now I've spoken with people like Dan Halpern and others that feel some of that's faded away. I've certainly sensed it.
Some of that recognition has faded away.
Yes, but it just occurred to me as I was writing this book. Well, he got that. I remember not knowing who he was in 1980, or I don't think I knew who he was, and seeing that photo of him peeking through the crack in the door as they're banging on the door.
At the photographers and the
photographers and all of that, still in his bathrobe. there's a whole, that's 40 years ago. There's a
Yeah.
whole couple generations that have been born that never saw that image, that never knew who he was, that don't remember the Nobel.
Yeah.
And this book was written in part for them.
Mm-hmm.
How do you bring someone to an enormous corpus of work? I mean, there's no end to it. You can't read everything by Miłosz just because there's so damn much of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you bring someone to that corpus? How do you teach them a little bit about who he was? I hope I've written a book that anyone can approach and start to learn something about who this amazing man that we were lucky to have live among us
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for so many years, what he did, his indefatigability, his restlessness. When he ran out of ideas for poetry, he began, these roadside dogs and ABCs, writing short bits of prose.
And they're delightful little books, those books that came out towards, pretty late in his life.
Yes, he translated much of the Bible into Polish. He learned
Yeah.
Hebrew in his 80s. He learned Hebrew, he wasn't in his 80s then. He taught himself Hebrews late in life so he could translate these books. One of Bob Haas's stories is he came to him when he was in his 80s and he was studying Lithuanian, which he'd never learned, although he'd been born there. And Bob Haas basically said, "Why are you bothering?"
Mm-hmm.
And Miłosz said, "Because I think it might be the language of heaven."
Okay, then, well, more power to him, of course.
But a mind that capacious and that restless itself would be something of note.
Mm-hmm.
And this astonishing body of poetry he left us that he could write because he was here.
Yeah.
And publish. It's a remarkable life. I felt remarkable to have met him and known him even briefly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The two of us were the last people in America to interview him, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he was already in Krakow when I sent him my questions via email, but that was also quite close to the end of his life, and I thought it was very sporting of him to even answer my question. So, okay, well, thank you. Why don't we open up the floor to our Zoom audience? There are some questions. I guess I would say to everybody listening, if you have a question, please type it into the chat window, and I can either read those questions to Cynthia, or can you see them in the chat window yourself, Cynthia?
I can see them, but please go ahead. Someone's written directly to me, and I'm not sure I can read it right now. So
okay, well, it might be rather than having you look at them, I'll read some of them as they
Okay.
come in, and you can answer them. The first question that was asked by Audrey Morosky, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she said, "Does Ms. Haven speak Polish, and has she read any of Milosz's work in Polish?"
no.
Okay, is that? I mean, I thought that was the answer, but I wondered whether, given your deep involvement in Miłosz, whether you had wanted to learn Polish, or whether that was.
Of course.
Mhm.
Of course. Most of his translators, Bob Haas doesn't speak Polish.
Mhm.
We've all picked up some Polish in dealing with his work. I don't think many of course, Ellen Valley does. Well, this is the conundrum we get into. I mean, I'm trying to absorb so much from so many other languages that we do through translation.
Mhm.
But I've benefited from the great translations that have been done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that he trained those people to translate him. But no, I don't speak Polish.
Okay. We have a question here from Steve Wasserman, who is not coincidentally the publisher of this book, who still apparently has questions for you. So what he says here is, California seems preeminently the land where history is weightless, devoted to the conceit that everyone can reinvent him or herself. How did Milosz grapple with the suffocations of history, indeed the ways in which, in so many ways, he was hostage to it, in a place where there was a kind of historical amnesia, which was almost the reigning sensibility, or even you might even say the ideology of California was that history erasing capacity of the mind?
Well, of course, he wrote about that. I think his answer was, in part, especially during that first decade, the history of Polish literature and post-war Polish poetry, the attempt to preserve his own culture before he adopted ours. Of course, he spoke about those things, and yet you mentioned self-reinvention. That's exactly what he did. He reinvented himself in America and in the English language. He said he never dreamt that he would be able to speak to an American audience or an English language audience, but thanks to his translations, which he fostered, which he encouraged, which he trained people to do, he had a new life here in English.
Yeah. Here's a question from B, sort of going back to the remark that you made earlier, saying, what did Miłosz adopt from the entrepreneurial spirit? What kind of philosophy advice helped him through challenging times? There's actually 3 questions here. What stands out from the time you met him? So the question about the entrepreneurial spirit, you answered a little bit before. You could answer that as well, but I would love to actually hear what stands out from your, personal encounters with him. You touch on that some in the book, but I'm sure the audience would love to hear that.
I only know him for a few hours on 2 days for an interview. It was a little sad for me because I thought it was going to be the beginning of a connection. And a few months after I met him, he went back to Poland and began having health problems and never came back, except for the funeral of his second wife. It was my great good luck. What was this about self-reinvention again? I'm sorry, I forgot the first part.
It was about what specifically did he take from the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of a place like California?
My goodness. I mean, well, post-war Polish poetry and the history of poetry. I mean, he trained people to understand his culture and his language. Again, the miracle of Polish poetry in the century was, the last century was largely his doing.
He became a one-man industry in a sense.
He became a one-man industry. I mean, like the enormous output of poetry and prose and reinventing forms to write in, like the ABCs, where he does this Polish form in English of just little short essays alphabetically. I mean, he traveled across the country, learning from, thinking of that excursion with Vanda in the 1940s, where he explored America. His effort to understand American poets from the very first days that he was here in New York. The industry of the man was phenomenal and generated from within himself.
Yeah.
He had deep spiritual roots, and I think that was the motor that powered him to survive everything.
Okay. John Evans, or perhaps John Evans Diesel, this member of the audience says, Miłosz has been described as believing in a Manichaean universe. Do you deal with this in your book, and do you think that this is so?
Miłosz loved heresy. He was Catholic, and yet he toyed with disbelief, and he could never quite, he was ambivalent about everything. He could never come out down decidedly on one side or another, but he was pained, as I am, with the torture of people and creatures and the death of everything. I have to admit that the heresy I was most fond of myself was apokatastasis,
Right.
which is in Bells of Winter, with the idea that everything is going to be like running on a film and it's all going to get rerun and perfected. I think that's a great idea.
And that no detail of human existence is lost. That everything
is lost. Everything
is recorded, basically.
Yes, all these people that have died, all these flowers that have died, everything gets recorded and has a permanent existence.
Okay. I think you've answered that one. Joe Cothrell, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, said, you mentioned briefly his relationship with the Polish community in the US. Could you speak a bit about that?
Well, there was a campaign against him when he came here. I do talk about that in the book. He thought many of the students joined his classes who were American, but their parents or grandparents had been Polish. And he was distressed at their lack of knowledge and their lack of application.
Mm-hmm.
That they weren't prepared for the rigor of his classes.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, he came from the intellectual class of the Polish literary world. And many of the immigrants who came from Poland were not of that class. A lot of them were poor farmers and factory workers and things like that. And so that I think that there were mismatching expectations of, it was not like the cafes of Krakow. It was not like the cafes of Warsaw. So there was less common bond, I think, with the Polish community in America than he had hoped or expected. Perhaps that's reaching. I don't know that he ever spoke about that. I know that he complained sometimes about Polish American students joining and just not being prepared for the rigor of the Polish literature that he was teaching.
Here's a question from Wendy Knox Carr. She says, what do you make of his comment that the night before he won the Nobel, he wished instead that his personal life would be healed instead? Would he really have done things differently if he could have, and in a sense, rewritten himself is the question.
Yes, I think he would have. The comment, I don't know if you got it from my book, was in the context of his son's madness. He had two sons. One of them had a psychological breakdown and never recovered. His brother, Tony Miłosz, as I say in the book, attributed that to the spying that was happening to them as children and the traumatic effect it had to be spied on both sides and not to be able to trust people around you. And he thinks that is what led to his younger brother's mental breakdown. And this has all been kind of the biography by Andrei Franacek, which is excellent too, talks about this, but the anguish, people always talk about his suffering in terms of the war, but the anguish of his personal life with the long, devastating illness of his first wife, with the madness of his son, have been underestimated in his life. And yes, I think he would have given it up to have a healthy family, to have
okay. Arturo De Simone says, what was Miłosz's relationship with the other exiles, those in the US and California especially? Did he share a sense of disappointment about the West with at least some other exiles from the Eastern Bloc as well as from other countries?
I don't understand the question.
Do you think Milos shared a sense of disappointment about the West with perhaps other exiles from the Eastern Bloc?
I have a long story about Alexander Vaught. That is another one of his accomplishments. I mean, he championed Alexander Vaught in the West and did a book-length interview with him, which is a classic, My Century, which was translated into English by one of his students, Richard Lurie. I think a lot of them came over as visitors, so I'm not sure how much they were exposed to America. I'm trying to think of somebody who would have been a long-standing I can't recall anyone with whom he had a long, that was a long resident rather than a visitor. I mean, he had many, many visitors, of course.
Yeah.
I'm sure that they also found the landscape daunting and
Yes.
the American advertising superficial and consumerist.
Yeah. I mean, I love Milos's description of, his adopted land as I think he said, a great republic, moderately corrupt. And that was we could all settle for that. That was a very reasonable and perhaps a happy situation to end up in. And it did actually, I had intended to ask you maybe a little bit about what was Miłosz an American patriot in any sense? He was certainly a Polish patriot in some sense, but again, I think mostly what mattered to him was a sort of imaginative portability of your sense of home.
Something Bob Haas told me that he became an American citizen and he was quite proud of being an American until he went back to Poland. And then all the resentment of being cut off from the land of his native tongue. He said some things that were more harsher about America. And Bob said it was as if he couldn't hold both places in his heart at once.
And that makes sense in a way. I mean, I do see the logic of it.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. I'm just looking at what the other questions are. I see a sort of a personal reflection here, quite interesting, although not a question that I can see. I guess I would just say, are there any more questions? If anyone has any, please do type them into the chat window, because I know Cynthia would be eager to answer them. And also, while we're waiting to see if there's another question, I wanted to urge you all in the strongest possible terms to buy this marvelous book. There is a link in the chat window which will enable you to buy it, I believe, directly from City Lights. So if you don't know by now, it is really a fantastic book and very much worthy of your attention. So I just wanted to put that plug in while we wait.
Well, ideas, things, you ask a question and then I think of more things about it and then those are flying out my windows as more questions come in. So there's so much more to say. That's the thing about him. He's endless. You just can't get done. And so that's why so many of us are preoccupied with him and spend so much time trying. You never exhaust him.
Okay. Well, because I don't see any more questions and because I feel that that's a lovely note to end on, why don't we wrap up? And I'll just say again, thanks to everyone for coming out. And Cynthia, thanks for a beautiful conversation.
This is the first time we've seen each other in 10 years.
It has been a very long time. It's been a pleasure. Maybe we'll even see each other in person someday, but this has been lovely. And so I just thank everybody for coming.